Hey there folks, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 Against Me fan, here with another episode of the Rapid Record Recap. What is the Rapid Record Recap, you may be asking? It is a monthly series that I do where I talk about all of the new releases that I heard in a given month that I had opinions about but didn't get to discuss on the channel for one reason or another. Maybe I ran out of time, maybe I discovered it a bit too late, or maybe I had some thoughts but just not enough to warrant fleshing out a full review for them, etc., etc. The point is, it's me listing off a bunch of albums that I heard that I felt some way about, and maybe also getting you to check out a few new releases that you may have been unaware of. So, without further ado, here is the February 2024 edition of the Rapid Record Recap. Hit Boy and the Alchemist, Theodore and Andre. This is a fun little collab EP between two giants in producing and production work right now. I mean, The Alchemist has been killing it for years right now, and despite being a fairly contentious figure, Hit Boy has also been doing pretty well for himself lately too, especially with his collaborations with Nas on the now finished King's Disease and Magic series. And I think as a whole, this is a nice little EP. It's very brief, it's very short, there's not much substance or meat here, honestly, and you could also argue that the opener, Morrissey, feels a bit too cliche for the Alchemist's sound, in particular with the dark and atmospheric strings and vibe about it, but I think the other two cuts are strong though, and as a whole, it's a pretty alright little EP. I don't necessarily think that this is for anyone other than completionists for two of the producers in question, but yeah, if you're really into The Alchemist, or if you're one of the rare people that's really into Hit Boy, then I'd say give this one a go. I'm going to give this EP 3 stars out of 5. Vijay, Iyer, Linda Mehan O, and Tyshawn Sorey, Compassion. This is a very traditional jazz album in nature, but the trio behind Compassion have proven themselves to have chemistry in the past, and that proves to be true here too. It doesn't really feel too adventurous, but I do think that each third of the trio gets to showcase their own semi-virtuosic abilities and talents, especially Vijay Iyer, who really kills it here. And I'm just gonna say, if you really seek the avant-garde, if your taste in jazz leans towards the more abstract, the more genre boundary pushing kind of works out there, maybe don't check this one out. It probably won't be for you, but if you can appreciate a really good, straightforward, and oftentimes deeply emotional and atmospheric jazz album, then yeah, this is probably one of the better jazz records that we've gotten so far this year, at least jazz records from major artists. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. The Last Dinner Party, Prelude to Ecstasy. Listen, I'm not here to make any arguments or statements about how this band very suddenly rose to massive relevance, especially in the mainstream UK music scene. I'm not here to comment on how sort of quote-unquote industry plant status or nepotism may have affected that. But what I am here to comment on is the quality of this record, and I mean, hey, it's very good. It's a lush album, the performances are really strong, the vocals in particular stand out to me. Lots of distinct melodies. I appreciate some of the classic glam influences going on here, some of the classic chamber pop influences too, that at the same time never really feel like nostalgia bait, but also don't necessarily feel like a total reinvention at the same time. Again, I think that there is a lot of discussion to be had around this band, not that any of it's important, just that there are a lot of discussions that can be had about them. But I think from a musical perspective alone, this is a good record, and I mean, yeah, if you're into this sort of thing, this very elegant style of pop rock, this sort of almost theatrical brand of those particular genres, then it's a good record. I'm going to give this album 3.5 stars out of 5. The God Fahim and Cookin Soul, Supreme Dump Legend, The Soul Cook Saga. This is the ever underappreciated rapper, the God Fahim, interestingly collaborating with the Spanish production collective Cookin Soul, and the primary reason I say that this collaboration is just really interesting in concept is that, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that Cookin Soul as a collective is actually collaborating with a rapper for a full-length release, in this case an EP, but hey, nonetheless. And for those who aren't in the know, Cookin Soul up to this point have been primarily known for their remixes and mashups, perhaps most heavily known for their MF Doom and A Tribe Called Quest Christmas-themed remix mashup records, but they kind of kill it here in terms of production in a way that I don't think I would have really expected from them. The god Fahim sounds as confident as ever here, with this perfect balance of somewhat dorky Wu-Tang-esque lyrical styles with a lot of much more tight flowing and overall aesthetics. I think that Cookin Soul's production here too is strong. It has this sort of classic boom bap meets modern abstract style that definitely has its own charm to it, and as a whole, I think that this is a really good collaboration. I think this is a really good EP, and I hope that the God Fahim keeps up what he's been doing for years and releasing way too many projects for me to keep track of, and I hope that Cookin Soul continues to collaborate with rappers into the future if this is a designation of the quality that they can put out when they meet forces with someone as talented as the God Fahim. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. J. Mascis. What do we do now? Dinosaur Jr. frontman and indie rock legend J. Mascis back with another solo album here, and honestly it has some of the best material we've heard from him in a while, both in context of his solo work and in the context of his body of work at large, including Dino J. I mean, this is arguably the most well-written and consistent project that he's been a part of since maybe 2014's Tied to a Star, maybe his last well-regarded and heavily discussed solo album, and What Do We Do Now sees Mascis stick to his guns and provide a series of very well-executed, deeply melodic rock songs, and I don't necessarily think that this record is super different from what you would expect from J. Mascis, but I'm personally fine with him being the AC/DC of indie, honestly. He just keeps putting out what sounds like the same album for every few years, and I mean, hey, it's high quality every time. There's some more folk rock adjacent cuts here that I really like as they combine themselves with a lot of more, again, melodic power pop sort of influences, and they ultimately feel just as melancholic as they do really pretty from both a production and from a compositional standpoint, and the album opener, Can't Believe We're Here, in particular, I would say really stands out as one of the lyrically strongest songs he's put out in quite some time, maybe even one of the crowning achievements of his solo career up to this point, which I suppose isn't really saying much considering the bulk of his work belongs to Dinosaur Jr., but still, nonetheless, it's something to say about the quality of that track in particular. Nothing new to see here for longtime J. Mascis fans, nothing new to see here for longtime Dino J fans, but if you vibe with J, then you'll vibe with this, because I know I do. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Birds in Row and Coilguns. You and I in the Gap. This EP is a really interesting meeting of two great artists within the realm of noisy music right now, with French post-hardcore band Birds in Row and Swiss noise rockers Coilguns coming together to produce what honestly might be my favorite EP of the year so far. The EP itself sees them jam in a way that is a proper melding of their two respective styles, and as a whole, I think that they really do play off each other really well, while at the same time combining together in a more singular sound into a more singular style. It's a deeply emotional listen as an EP, especially the closing track with some very visceral vocals in particular. I think that this is just a really instrumentally dense but atmospherically airy record that feels extremely charismatic in terms of it conveying both respective sounds of Birds in Row and Coilguns, as well as the genuine passion that the two have for making music and that they have for collaborating with each other here. And again, like I said, I think that this honestly might be my favorite EP of the year so far. I'm not really going to say how that's going to rank at the end of the year, considering it's the beginning of March as I film and upload this, but nonetheless, still a fantastic EP, and if you haven't heard it, then what are you doing? Go listen to it. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Callie Malone, All Life Long. The latest album from composer and sound art experimentalist Callie Malone is another really strong effort from her. A super dynamic album. It feels like she really wrings a lot out of the atmosphere going on here. It's something to really get lost in, and while I don't see myself revisiting this too terribly much, that's definitely not the intent of a record like this. This is the kind of album that you're supposed to just feel and absorb on a much deeper level than my dorky critical listening ears are ever trying to perceive constantly. So, yeah, if this is your kind of thing, I'd say definitely go for it. I mean, I'm not even a diehard sort of ambient fan or person who knows the history of ambient music like the back of my hand or anything like that, but even I can pretty deeply appreciate just how much effort, just how much life can be found within this record, and I think that if that sounds interesting to you, then you probably will be able to as well. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. The return of Shygirl with her latest EP, and the house pop club music kind of fusion going on here, I gotta say, is significantly less unique than what she was developing in terms of the more artsy and pop-based, but sort of ambient pop and synth-pop-based side of her music back on Nymph in 2022, but that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, and I still think this EP is pretty solid overall. It's pretty fun, it's got a definite sense of vibrant production about it, it's very clean, it's very punchy, it's very bouncy, and from that perspective, I really enjoy this. I do feel that it lacks some of the unique artistic and creative identity that Shygirl was developing for herself just a couple of years ago, and that this could have really been released by a lot of artists out there right now, but as a whole, I still think it's a solid EP, and I do genuinely enjoy it. I don't adore it, I don't think I'll revisit it a ton, and I appreciate it more than anything. I respect its execution more than anything, but if you're just looking for some really shiny, upbeat, easily digestible music that you aren't constantly hearing in every single radio station and every single piece of media out there, then I'd say give this EP a go. It's definitely worth your time in that case. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Little Simz, Drop 7. Man, it was a good month to be an EP. Little Simz has pretty much undeniably been becoming one of the most notable rappers in the UK at the moment, especially with her 2021 release, Sometimes I Might Be Introvert, a modern classic, a classic in the making, whatever you want to call it, definitely a record that will be well regarded decades from now, and I think people have begun to realize that already only 3 years after its initial release, but I digress, that's not even the most recent thing she's done. The most recent thing she's done is this little EP right here, the Drop 7 EP, the first entry in her long-running Drop series of EPs since 2020's Drop 6, and this sees a definite change-up for her creatively, though I wouldn't really say a bad one, as she leans much more heavily into dance-oriented songs, into club-ready kind of songs, which is certainly not what people were really expecting just based on her more jazz, her more semi-abstract, her more boom-bap-related tendencies throughout her last couple of LPs. But I think the change in pace is nice overall. I think she executes it well. There are a lot of very odd instrumentals here, especially some influences from the Brazilian funk scene, which I am mostly unaware of, and honestly, this EP just encouraged me to check it out, and it's frankly baffling in the best way. And as a whole, I think that this EP manages to really capture Lil Simz at her most fun, at her most upbeat, while still maintaining this sort of nocturnal sort of vibe about it. I think that this is a good EP, and I can understand the polarizing reception it's faced up to this point. That's definitely valid, especially if you were expecting more of the same from her last couple of albums. But in my opinion, the Drop 7 EP is one of the better Drop EPs up to this point, a really good experiment on Lil Simz's part, and if she goes with this sound for a full-length release in the future, then I'm all for it. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Chelsea Wolfe, She Reaches Out To, She Reaches Out To, She. Ignoring my absolute despise for this title and how long it is, I think that this is a really good record from Chelsea Wolfe overall. I think it balances the harshness and the gothic ambience of a lot of the record very nicely. There are a couple passages that lose me a little bit as they maybe extend the ambient passages just a bit too much, maybe slightly overstay their welcome, but as a whole, her presence is as menacing as it's ever been, and I think that it's somewhat disappointing that eyes are maybe a little bit less on her than they were 5 or so years ago, because for the most part, I would argue that she's still in peak form artistically, and this record definitely proves that. It's a strong record. Again, does lose me at a couple parts, but I would highly recommend it if you're looking for a really strong gothic-oriented album for the year. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Brittany Howard, What Now? I feel like this is kind of Brittany going through the motions at this point, with some pretty predictable, semi-summery psychedelic vibes going on here, while maintaining a large degree of the soulfulness that she has demonstrated on previous records. And I do like the back half of this album, for the most part at least. I enjoy the fact that it goes for some more anthemic moments, a la the Sly Stone-esque Call for Unity on Another Day, but as a whole, I don't think that really adds a ton to the album. I don't think it necessarily has that much impact. It just kind of adds a bit more variety to the track list here, and I can at least appreciate that when I'm listening to an album I'm not that into multiple times for the sake of reviewing it on this channel. She's a strong vocalist and multi-instrumentalist, no question. She's an extremely talented woman. It's just that I don't really walk away with anything from this album. No distinct melodies, no moments where I'm really blown away by any of her qualities as a performer. She sounds extremely confident here, but I don't really hear anything that said confidence is being used for. There's no moments where her vocals just really strike me in a certain way, or where maybe a certain instrumental passage just really grabs me. And that's a shame, because she has managed to do all of those things numerous times in the past. It just so happens that none of those really pop up here. Her previous works have proven that she's capable of great things. It's just that I feel like her second album away from Alabama Shakes as a solo artist is just a touch underwhelming. Not the worst thing in the world, just kind of mediocre. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Yeat, 2093. I've never really been a hater for Yeat or anything like that, unlike a lot of other people have been, but at the same time, I recognize that while the guy was changing the game in terms of a lot of the popular sounds within rap at the moment, I never really felt like there was a ton of potential for him to grow in any direction that felt significantly different from what he's been doing for years now at this point, and I'm willing to admit that I was wrong. Listen, I'm not saying that 2093 is my favorite album of the year so far or anything like that. I still do think it's a bit bloated, like virtually everything else that he's put out up to this point. And there are a couple moments, maybe just a couple verses that don't really sit with me quite as well as many of the other moments on this album do. But as a whole, man, this is a major step up for him creatively, in my eyes at least. A lot of the instrumentals here feel so much better suited for some of the more boundary-pushing flows and delivery styles that he's been working with for a good period of time at this point. Some moments here almost feeling kind of electro-industrial, and the way that his more traditional trap influences are fused into those abstractions is absolutely amazing, and I really hope that those kind of sounds and influences rub off on the rest of the mainstream to at least some extent that is genuine, because I think that not only is there a ton of potential still here for Yeat to continue growing, which is something I never thought I would be able to say, but I just feel like this is the major leap forward that I've been looking for, and that maybe he's even needed to retain relevance outside of his own fan base. I think that this is the album that has truly established him as someone who's probably going to be around for years to come, and I hope that I don't end up having to eat my words in the next few years for having said that. So yeah, I cut down on the runtime by like 15-20 minutes, but other than that, I don't really have a ton of complaints here. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Blemishes, Ambivert. This is the debut studio album from the Julien Serron-led noise project Blemishes, and this is pretty excellent overall. I mean, the noisy passages here are filled with the kind of earnesty, love, and passion that you would really want from a record like this, but that kind of thing also sort of happens when you are pouring your creative identity and soul into an album for roughly 5 years, so that's to be expected, but and nonetheless, it results in an album that, in the moments where I'm really in the mood for it, can actually kind of strike me in a very emotional way that I wouldn't have expected personally. There are some more nuanced moments here that I like a lot as well. I Want to Be Water is probably my most distinct kind of memory of this album just because of the fact that I really love the tripped out ambient piece that it becomes. I think it's a really interesting and intriguing moment on the record that manages to stand out completely. I also think that you have a lot of moments that are just really lovely, serene moments despite all of the noise. I'm going to give this album a somewhat lower score than what you might think just based on what I've said so far, but that's not so much to do with the fact that I think this album has weaknesses. It's just that I think there's a lot of potential here, and what is here is very, very good, and I'm excited to see what comes next for Blemishes, if anything, really. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Laura Jane Grace, Hole in My Head. This is probably the best non-Against Me work that we've gotten from Against Me frontwoman Laura Jane Grace up to this point. I mean, the songwriting here is pretty excellent overall, and her lyricism on select cuts like Cuffing Season, as well as Keep Your Wheels Straight, the former of which is actually one of my favorite more singer-songwriter adjacent cuts of the year so far, and the latter of which features an Elliott Smith reference that I deeply appreciate. They're some of the best work that we've seen from her, coming from her various other projects, whether it be The Devouring Mothers or her solo career, and some of the best songwriting that we've gotten from her since Against Me's Transgender Dysphoria Blues a full decade ago. And most of the instrumentals are pretty strong too, with the only real miss, I would say, being I'm Not a Cop. I just don't really think that that one clicks as much for me as the rest of the album does, but it's still a solid track, and the back half of this album in particular is filled with pretty much nothing but genuinely excellent songs that really elevate the quality of the record from a very good one to a genuinely great one that I would highly recommend if you have dismissed some of Laura's solo stuff up to this point. I think that this is probably the best thing she's put out in the sort of non-Against Me era of her career. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Blue and Royal Blue. This is a collab EP between veteran rapper Blue and producer Roy Royal that turns out to be pretty solid overall. I mean, like I said, Blue is a veteran of the genre, and it shows here. He doesn't really do anything new with his personality or his flow, but he doesn't really need to. He's been great for decades, and he continues to be pretty great to this very day, even if he doesn't consistently release excellent projects all of the time. And the pure confidence and at times fun writing style that he brings to the table definitely has a lot of charisma behind it and carries this EP pretty much the entire time. I do think that Roy Royal's production here is at times a bit restrained and at other times not restrained enough. I mean, it feels too restrained at times in that it's just a lot of the samples feel like they're just being put in there for the sake of being samples because it's essential, but at the same time, it feels like he's not restrained enough when a song just ends with a collage of samples with no real direction or way to properly end a song, or at the very least bleed one song into the next. And that's not to say his production is horrible or anything like that. There definitely is some solid work here. The mixing here is strong as well. I think it sounds fine. I just kind of wish that there was maybe a bit more distinct creative identity from Roy Royal as a producer, even if he does do a decent job overall. So, yep, still a solid EP, not one of the best I've heard lately or anything like that, but it's always nice to see more from Blue, so I can't really complain too much. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Idols, TANGK. If you've been paying attention to music often brought up in music nerd discussions and circles, then I don't think I really need to tell you how Idols went from a very hyped up post-punk band to a bit of a punchline at times with a series of legitimately negatively received albums while still maintaining their own fan base that tends to be generally positive, though at times a bit more mixed about their recent material. And hey, I'll defend some of their more recent work like Ultra Mono, but yeah, no, TANGK, I'm not defending this one. I mean, this album just kind of feels largely devoid of personality overall. The more energetic moments never feel all that contagious, and some of the slower tracks like Monolith ultimately feel a bit directionless, like the auditory equivalent of a wet paper towel, just not really achieving anything. It just feels like soggy music, the slower tracks, and that's about the best way that I can describe it. I mean that in a negative way, to clarify. I think my biggest qualm about Idols as a band at this point, despite not really being that exciting from an instrumental standpoint, is actually frontman Joe Talbot, who seemingly becomes closer and closer to self-parody with each passing release. He still tries to do these somewhat cartoonish vocals and everything, but it all just feels kind of forced and really just sort of strained. He doesn't feel like he's naturally bringing this aggressive energy to the table, and that's totally fine and respectable, but I don't think that he should keep chasing the same highs that he tries to on here, because it just feels like he never can quite reach them. At times, in the worst moments of this record, it almost feels like him as a performer is equivalent to someone who heard an artsy post-punk band once and just tried to copy their vocals, like a person who heard one Gang of Four or one Viagra Boys song and just ran with it with a band that has been playing post-punk for maybe longer than they've really wanted to. That's kind of what this album ends up sounding like. The overarching theme of love here is vague at best and honestly kind of corny. I feel like if that's the direction they wanted to go into, they could have maybe put some more effort into making that feel like a legitimate theme here rather than just something that's kind of there but also not really. It's just the lack of dedication that bothers me when this was something legitimately discussed with members of the band in the weeks coming before the release of this record. And above all else, the only thing I really get out of this album is the track Dancer, and not because that's a good song, but because LCD Soundsystem are featured on it, and not only are they one of my favorite bands, but it also gives me hope that a band better than Idols will drop new music in the near future. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Friko, Where We've Been, Where We Go From Here. Debut album from American indie pop, indie rock band Friko, or we'll go with Friko. There's a pretty monumental amount of hype surrounding this record, at least for the size of this band's fan base and the fact that this is their first full-length studio album. And honestly, it's not that hard to see why. I mean, some of the people working on this album have collaborated with legends like Animal Collective and Sufjan Stevens, as well as some more recent critical darlings like Japanese Breakfast and Yule, and that means that this is a super well-produced, well-made album that knows how to execute this very lush, dramatic sense of indie rock, and the band know how to do it equally as well, with a deep sense of honesty, emotional earnesty being found in a lot of the songwriting here and a lot of the performances here. The vocal work is really strong, and I do think that there are times where frontman Nico Capitan does get maybe a little washed out by the instrumentals, which is a shame because I do think that he has some solid vocals going for him here. But yeah, as a whole, I think this is a really good debut. I can understand the hype around it, and I believe the hype. I think that this band, should they choose to put out more music in the future, could go on to do amazing things, and as it stands, this is already very, very good. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Real Estate, Daniel. I think there's an argument to be made that Real Estate could be considered one of the definitive light, fluffy, filler indie pop bands of the 2010s into the 2020s, but I don't mean that in an insulting way or anything like that. I mean, sure, their stuff isn't the most dense or anything like that, but they've consistently been very enjoyable over the years, and despite the fact that you could make a pretty valid argument that they are past their peak, past their prime, etc., Daniel is a still pretty solid album overall. I mean, they still know how to write a really good hook and chorus or two on tracks like Victoria and Water Underground, the latter of which I thought was going to be a Talking Heads tribute, which it disappointingly was not. And, I mean, as a whole, you know, this is extremely delicate ear candy, and from that perspective, it doesn't really impress a ton, but it's fairly memorable overall, and it's something that's easy to revisit, and I think that it's pretty easy to appreciate this record from that perspective. I mean, if that doesn't really sound like something that appeals to you, totally understandable, totally fine, but for me, myself, I personally enjoy this record. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Kid Cudi, Insano, Nitro Mega. You know what's funny? Earlier this year, I thought that the first Kid Cudi Insano album got maybe a little bit too much hate, despite being bad. I saw some people calling it the absolute antichrist of albums for the first quarter of the year, but I don't know, it was bad, don't get me wrong. I gave it a 2 out of 5, I'm pretty sure, but it wasn't the worst thing in the world. This one, however, I think gets just the right amount of hate. It's a little bit better, but really not that much. In fact, it's just about the same. It's just different. It's a random surprise release, and there's nothing to really take away here. Everything just feels uninspired for the most part. I mean, Pusha T's on it. That's kind of cool, but Cudi doesn't sound like he really wants to be there. Most of the instrumentals are feeling extremely uninspired, boring pop rap that you can easily find everywhere within the mainstream trap scene and have been able to find within the past 5 years or so. There are a couple moments where it feels like Cudi's trying to get maybe a little more trippy, and those just feel kind of forced, but at the same time, they also do sort of break up the album a little bit, so it's at least a little bit easier to digest, and it's not just a solid slab of mediocrity in one form, it's a multicolored slab of mediocrity in various forms. And yeah, as a whole, it's bad, but it's the same kind of bad that the first Insano album was, just in a different variety almost. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of the Rapid Record recap for February of 2024. I didn't upload a ton this month because my tummy hurt for a really long time. And my tummy still hurts, so I guess I'll see you again in either a day or 17 years, one of the two. But until then, I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.